Welcome to the Global Experience Leaders series, where we talk to the leaders behind the multilingual digital future, how they lead, innovate, and grow their careers. I'm Spence Green, CEO of Lilt, and this week we're joined by Jochen Hummel, who is the founder and CEO of Trados and is currently CEO of Coreon. Founder of Trados, everybody knows, doesn't need much more introduction. Today I'm with Jochen Hummel, who is the CEO of Coreon, but formerly he started Trados, which of course everybody is familiar with. So thank you for joining me today, Jochen.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Spence.
So you're a self-taught engineer, I understand,
That's
and
correct.
are you kind of amazed that the first product that you built is still being used in some form, I don't know, almost 40 years later? And how do you account for the enduring success of this product?
Well, not really 40 years, but quite some time. Yes, I am amazed and I am surprised because typically in technology, of course, things develop and progress much faster, but certain developments last longer than one would think. And translation memory till a couple of years ago was the best way to do things. And once a product is established, of course, then it develops a certain foothold and is hard to replace.
And was when you started Trados, that was your first company, and it came out
Correct.
of work you were doing at IBM at the time, I think. Is that right?
Yes. So IBM was the first company which really did localization on a bigger scale into many languages, and but they had very complex products which were very hard to localize, and they were looking for people who knew some English, which I hardly did, but anyhow was good enough for translating the stuff, and but who could deal with the complexity of the localization process and the formats and so on. And that's how I got in there as a freelancer, and then very quickly learned how to process huge volumes, and that led then to the foundation of Trados first as a as a service company, but then later we kind of spun off the service part and focused completely on software development.
So did Trados start as a project in response to requirements for IBM, or the sort of the ideas that came out of that contract work then led to the company and the product?
Yeah, a bit of both. IBM at that time was very, very advanced. So they had a lot of stuff which still today is considered to be modern. They were not really aware of it. That was their problem, but they were very advanced. So I had the privilege to learn a lot of things like tagging text, for example,
Right.
and then the concept of translation memory and other things. But IBM was not very good in making really use of it and productizing these things. So I saw an opportunity there and started to then develop our own product.
I think people also, sort of outside of the research community also may not be fully aware that actually the resurgence in machine translation research also happened at IBM in the late 80s at IBM Research in Yorktown Heights. Because IBM was just doing so much translation at that time, like it was a problem that lots of people worked on at IBM.
Yep.
And 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 I guess another thing that's maybe not widely known is that the whole concept of translation memory, to my knowledge, I could sort of trace the literature back to the late 70s at one point, came from a frustrated translator in Europe who was working with machine translation and basically said, stop giving me this garbage that's not useful. Can you just give me things that I've done in the past and I'll reuse them? And that was kind of the motivation. So I wonder, was IBM already using the concept of translation memory, or this is
They tried.
something that
They
sort of
tried.
developed in your work with them?
Now, they tried. The first commercial product I knew in that field was ALPS, Automatic Language Processing System, which was actually coming, was a development from Mormons in Utah.
BYU, right?
Exactly.
That's right.
We had a lot
That was
of,
Alan Melby and team.
yeah, we had a lot of stuff to translate as well. And
Right.
IBM tried to make it work, but you have to see the context of let's say, the hardware available at that time. We're talking mid 80s, and a normal IBM PC hardly could do it, right? Two floppy drives, and that was it. So
Right.
they had to use it. They had to use a rather powerful machine at that time, which cost you something like $20,000 and was not running under MS-DOS. So the barriers, of course, for having such kind of machinery and software in an industry which is dominated by freelancers, of course, was cost prohibitive. But it was just at the time where things start to, or PCs start to get more and more powerful and also cheaper. And we then saw an opportunity with more modern development tools and programming languages to develop something which could even run on a 386 PC at that time.
And now, I didn't actually know this part of the story. And I think this is true until reading before this conversation. But multi-term was your other product,
Correct.
and that's of course still being used today as well in some incarnation. So I guess why were there two different products versus just making these into the same product as they commonly are now?
Because at that time, terminology management and translation memory were two very distinct products, primarily because for translation memories, of course, you needed to have the source in digital format. And in
Right.
most cases, that was not true. So very often people were typing from paper into a word processing file. But of course, what they could already use at that time was some sort of terminology management, which was, let's say, more of an online dictionary. This you could use in any case, whereas translation memory required, of course, that you have the source available in digital format, and that, of course, you were processing volumes where some repetitions would be to be expected.
I see, and right. So it's sort of different workflow at that time based on the limitations of what was in digital format and what wasn't.
Indeed, yeah.
Right, right. And
Even today, there are
you're
people that work in PDF. So I mean, certain
that's right.
things.
That's right. It's no different than working from scanned PDFs or something today. That's right. That's right. When you started the company, I'm assuming this was your first company, but what was the first couple of years? Were you doing sales, running the business? Were you still writing code? Like, what was it like starting a company in those early days, and what were the different jobs that you did?
Well, I did everything. You just started to list it already. I was
Yeah,
coding, mainly during the nights and weekends, and during the day I was selling
that
and
sounds familiar.
supporting,
Yeah,
writing
right.
documentation, and so basically everything. And I
Yeah.
did this for many years because at that time in Germany it was almost impossible. VC was unheard of. Getting a loan very hard, very difficult. So we kind of had to do it step by step out of own cash flow and a lot of endurance to build up that business. That's also one of the reasons why it took a while, because the big acceleration you have today with venture millions were simply not available.
Yeah, so you were in Stuttgart in the former West Germany, and not much, no venture capital. Just had to build it the old-fashioned way out of
Way
profits. Yeah,
by step, making money, selling your stuff,
making money. Right.
which can be
And how
healthy.
big was it? It certainly builds fortitude, I think.
Yep.
How big was the team in the say the first 10 years of the company? Because you had the
Very,
exit in the early 2000s. So how big was the team maybe in that first decade?
very small. We were a handful of people, so around 10 or so. Yeah.
Okay. So you got to, boy, it was right around 2003 ish. I think you ran the company right up until you sold the company to SDL. Is that right?
Actually, 2005, the company was sold. But
2005.
we, in the first internet bubble, we started to relocate the headquarter from Stuttgart to the US, to Alexandria in Virginia. Started to raise money because already at that time we saw an opportunity to create some sort of a translation marketplace on the internet. Raised a lot of money. It was a great idea, but premature, I would say.
Uh huh.
And um, so in all this During these developments, of course, a lot changed. We got venture capital on board. We hired an American development. We then did a merger with a company in California, Uniscape. So a lot changed in the business, of course, and in that process also, we got. I stepped down as a CEO, but was in different roles as chairman and as head of development and running Europe and so on. But we had then also a very different management team than we had before we went to the US. So.
I hadn't heard that part of the story. So was the idea like an early Uber for translators around the year 2000? Is that what you were
Yeah,
thinking?
that was what we
And
wanted
did
to do
did you ever
because
actually end up
we
building that?
figured that it's one thing I really feel a bit bad about. Um, so Trados, I think, was a let's say, genius tool for translators to make a lot of money. And some
Yeah.
translators also did, who realized, oh man, but most of them didn't. Most of them were finding many good reasons why not to use that tool. And in the end, what happened is that the big content creators discovered Trados and discovered the analysis in there and figured out, oh, why do we pay for words which already have been translated? And then it was pushed from the top down to the supply chain to the end to the linguist. So of course, people who are late to the innovation, they don't see any benefit, and particularly the supply chain in between. So we thought already at that time, how great would it be if we would connect the content creators, uh, big IT companies or manufacturing companies, with the people who actually do the work, and kind of bringing them together on a platform. And that vision till today really isn't there yet. But at that time, it
That's
was
correct.
premature. Technology played a role, but it was also lack of the infrastructure on the internet. Connecting, let's say, Microsoft with a freelance translator in the Czech Republic and make them exchange files, contracts, money simply was not possible.
Yeah, even today that's very challenging. So
Even today.
I hadn't known that anybody had attempted that back even that far back. That's fascinating.
We did. And then we kind of took the, let's say, the internet part away and condensed it to an intranet solution. So rather have a workflow solution within a company where then transacting or executing all these transactions or so would be done by an ERP system or so. But that we at least the content flow and the workflow that we at least could bring this together. And that's what we did then together with Uniscape. And these were the early, let's say, translation management systems.
And you didn't did you didn't build a translation management system because in parallel in the late 90s Idiom was getting started and building World Server, which now, Trados and World Server are very hooked together.
Yeah, we did actually.
You
But
did build it.
more, let's say these TMSs have different flavors. And so we were
Uh-huh.
building something we called a Teamworks, which was more like a workflow process automation, less of a transaction system. But yes, actually,
Right.
we also went that way. Yeah.
And did that product survive the acquisition or it was just kind of shut down?
It survived it for quite a while. It might be still around today. I mean, SDL at a certain point ended up with, I don't know how many workflow systems. With every acquisition, you
three
get another.
three or four TMSs, right?
Exactly. Same
Yeah.
what happens to LSPs who merge. And when SDL merged with Trados, that would have been a good occasion to just stop, say halt, and make a new one and bring these things together. But that's not what happened. Yeah.
Now you ran this company for 20 years. That's a long time as
That's
a
a long time.
CEO.
Yeah.
And I find even sort of looking back in the early days of the company as a first time founder, you kind of look back and you think, gosh, if I had known what I know now, that would have taken me, half the time, and I wouldn't have struggled nearly as much with various things that turned out to be actually really important. I wonder if, when you sort of look back on that, is there anything that given your experience and where you sit now, you would have done differently or you would have thought about differently?
Yeah, of course, tons of things, of course. Yeah. Um,
Right.
I don't know whether I should be proud or ashamed about that long time. Yeah. It both has pros and cons. Definitely was too long, but it was not really by choice. And the first 10 years really were very slow and very hard, and a lot of, let's say, hard work trying to generate cash flow and so on. So, taking, if you cut this away, the time was a bit shorter, of course. Um, but I think somewhere, if I give advice to or share experiences with younger entrepreneurs, there's middle ground. I think going out there with the goal to exit and flip a company, I think it's not very healthy. On the other hand, running a business as long as I did prevents you from doing it again and again and again. And very often, many successful entrepreneurs, they need 4 or 5 times until they're successful, because every time you make new mistakes, every time you learn
Right.
new things. And within a company, of course, after a while, the environment is less dynamic. You still learn, but it takes longer. It's the different kind of learning. So looking back, I think 10 years would have been good enough.
Right.
It was not my choice.
10 years. So maybe running it for 20 years is also not healthy.
It was a bit long.
Right.
As I said, it
Yeah.
was not really of choice, and there were different phases, and the company, of course, completely changed. So let's say the dynamic phase where it really started to take off in the mid 90s was something like 10 years.
10 years, right. And now, so you, and this commonly happens. People stay in localization for a while, then they go off somewhere, and then they come back to language. Your detour was to go off into like sort of a second life,
Yeah.
online world kind of excursion before you came back. So, of all the problems that you could have worked on, why'd you pick that one?
Maybe because it was as hard as language. I always liked engineering challenges, and that was about as difficult as it could get. So I don't know. I mean, the deeper reason is I like science fiction a lot. I read the book Snow Crash. It really left a big impression on me, and I thought, hey, maybe we should build a product out of this, and that's what we tried. But it was
Yeah,
very hard.
that was
Timing is
your Neil
important. That's
Stevenson phase of entrepreneurship.
you have to hit the right time, right? So, as an innovator, and that's the biggest challenge, often you're too early, and then you're a pioneer in the field. You end up with arrows in the back, and somebody else is making the money. Innovation, timing, it's hard, but on the other hand, it's a lot of fun as well to do these things. So, business-wise, it's sometimes better to wait a bit and let the pioneers clear the path. But fun-wise, it's definitely yeah, a good thing to do, fun thing to do.
And what did you? I mean, that's going from sort of Trados, which certainly has a B2C component selling to translators, but mostly a business product. To then
Yeah.
going to a consumer product. What did you learn, whether it be in sales or product development, going off in a completely different direction before you came back that you're now applying once you've come back to language?
That's a difficult question. I mean, of course, what we did, Metaversum and Twinity was the product, which is still running, by the way, as well. Of course, totally different field and totally different way of positioning, marketing it, um, different customer base, different values. So I think what I learned there, or what I try to use in my current businesses, is the importance of product market fit, and the importance of having a story and having an underlying narrative, and also what also has changed, I think, to have applications which are visually very compelling and pleasant to use. So I think many B2B products, they look awful, and they're also, they don't only look awful, it's often they're also awful to use. With a consumer product, you can't do that. It has to look great, and it has to be very easy to use, and there's a lot. of what you can learn from consumer products and bring them back into B2B products. They don't have to look like they often do, and they also don't have to be really difficult to use.
Yeah, certainly the sort of consumerization of the enterprise and bringing usability concepts into the enterprise is a big trend, and the
Big
more
trend, but
modern products are
long way
more
to go.
accessible. Right. So then you decided to come back to language, and why that?
As usual, very often it's not really a well thought through decision, but question of opportunities and possibilities. And of course, I had my network in that industry and
Hmm.
many connections, and of course also a fairly deep knowledge, reputation, and so on. So it's more like where the next opportunity pops up, and also of course where you have not only some legacy, but also, let's say, an expertise, but also what's interesting you. And so all this together, I think, was not a decision as such that I said, now I go back into language, but more like, oh, that sounds interesting. Maybe we can do something here.
And so what you're running two companies right now. One of them that's more linguistic data management, and the other language services. Tell what are the two different companies and the motivation for having two companies instead of one?
Well, it's a bit different. So the one company, Esteem, is a language technology company, but primarily
Hmm.
doing projects. And so developing solutions and running projects for larger customers.
Yep.
And in Esteem, we have developed nice technology and good expertise, and we decided to productize that. But for this purpose, we founded a second company to turn that kind of knowledge and code and algorithms and so on into a software as a service solution. And we figured out that the best way to do this is to have a second company, but they're fairly closely related. They have similar shareholders and so on. But doing projects and doing products are two very different things. So I figured out it's good to have this in two different companies and to be able to run with two different, let's say, DNAs and still leverage from one to the other expertise, knowledge, personnel, cash as well, and so on.
So how do you split your how do you run your week between the two different companies? Do you dedicate certain days to certain companies, or there's a
No,
lot more overlap during the day?
no, it's a lot of overlap during the day. So it's not that I have a fixed schedule or so, but as I said, I mean,
Hmm.
it's fairly closely related. So it's not really a big challenge. Also, these are not very big businesses. So management-wise, it's also not a big challenge. If one would grow much more than what it is currently, I think I would reconsider then, of course. Yeah. But for now, it's not really an issue. I have a very good team, a great team, which is working very independent. So it's not so that they need a lot of direction, meetings, and stuff. So we are a small, very professional, high qualified, self-managed team. So therefore, it's not really a big issue.
And do the two companies have the same leadership team, or you sort of keep the two teams quite separate?
It overlaps. It overlaps. So
Overlaps.
it shares me, for example, but it also has a different. So there's an overlap, but it has a different leadership team. Yeah.
So talk about growth dynamics in this industry. There hasn't been sort of a huge no entrepreneur has built like a huge company in this industry. It's still pretty fragmented with, several different companies that have made it over, $100 million in revenue, but certainly nobody's made it over $1 billion in revenue or built a bigger company. What do you did you think about that when you came back into language, or what was your sort of the scope of your ambition when you came back to the language industry, and how do you think about building a company in this industry?
So when I went back into this industry, I was having the experience of two. In the end, Trados was venture funded.
Yeah.
Metaversum was completely venture funded. So two VC funded businesses, and they come with their. Of course, you can accelerate your business. You can be faster. You can do a lot of things, but they also, of course, it also has its downsides. So what I was appreciating coming back is to be able to run business which are management funded, and where we can do very interesting, very innovative things, but we stay in ownership of our timing. So that's a huge privilege, I think, as an entrepreneur, that you don't have a certain burn rate and you have to achieve certain goals and you have to give certain returns so that the wheel keeps turning. Therefore, the two businesses I'm currently running, we are lean and mean, and we live off our profits and of our cash flow. And that makes you, as an entrepreneur, very independent and very free. I really appreciate that. And that's often more worth than doubling or tripling or doing whatever moonshot. However, having said that, of course, I've also seen how some businesses have developed. I'm serving on some boards, or did serve on some boards. And I have to say that I was skeptical 10 years ago or so, or 15 years ago, about the future of the industry, because I was seeing certain mega trends, like products having less and less documentation or no documentation at all, and a certain degree of automation. But I think I was wrong at that time. Maybe you know Arturo Quintero from Moravia. He said one day that his business could be a $1 billion company, right? And I said, come on, what are you dreaming of? I often think back to that dialogue because I think he was right. It could have been, and it's still true today. The problem is that most LSPs or most leaders in that field um, come from an environment which is a service environment, service delivering environment, and growing a service business, of course, is very hard. And there's not enough differentiation against your competition to grow as you can do in the tech space. So, but having said that, I think the market is huge, and if you redefine localization into something else, definitely you could grow a billion or bigger company. And of course, technology, particularly in the recent years, is accelerating at a breathtaking path, which of course gives totally new opportunities. And I think that we don't have to wait too long, that this will change and that the fragmentation eventually will be overcome and there will be really a big business. And I wouldn't mind to be part of such a development.
So you mentioned macro trends that you saw a couple of years ago. Let's prognosticate about the future a little bit. What are the sort of 1 to 2 trends or ideas that you think could lead into building that business, or sort of fundamentally change the way that we do language work?
Yeah. I mean, when I was selling, I told you before that I did everything. I was coding, but I also went to trade shows and sold this stuff. And there was always this thing that people already 20, 30, 40 years ago or more were dreaming, of course, of machine translation. And I always had to defend the concept of translation memory against the concept of machine translation. And what I told these people is that, look, of course, it would be nice to have this, but in order to translate, you need to understand. And when a machine really understands, then machine translation will be a footnote of a totally different revolution, because then most of us can go home. And I believed this till, let's say, 3, 4 years ago. But then I reconsidered that thought, and the flaw, I think, is in the word understanding. So what does understanding mean? Of course, machines do not have an understanding so that we could have the conversation we have right now yet. Yeah? But in order to do many things like translation or summarization or so, you don't need that much understanding. So the quality of neural machine translation has become so good that somehow the machine or the neural network understands it well enough to produce a very, very good translation. What this understanding is, we don't really know, as we don't know how humans understand. So if you stack these levels high enough, then eventually something like understanding happens. We cannot put our fingers on it, and we don't know what it is, but it does work well enough, and it does understand it to a degree that it can translate. And I think that will fundamentally, of course, change the industry, and will also, unfortunately, and you have maybe seen some articles or tweets from me about this, eventually make translation memory obsolete, because once machines translate well enough that it's more a question of reviewing what they did. Translation memory, of course, and fuzzy matching has lost its importance.
Yeah, certainly these new neural machine translation systems that can condition on a lot of linguistic context. Translation memory can, in some cases, just condition on the previous segment, and so you sort of have these matching artifacts that reviewers then have to clean up. If machine translation is good enough, that whole situation just goes away.
Exactly. That becomes a fundamental different thing. And I think actually it's a good development. Many translators, of course, are scared of it and they try to argue against it. But it's a bit short-sighted as they were arguing against translation memory 20 years ago, because doing words is not that much fun. If you work in a collaborative AI model, still somebody needs to train the AI, needs to curate the content, needs to set up the processes, define quality. I mean, there are a lot of important tasks you need to do in order to make this happen. And all these tasks require much more skill, much more expertise and knowledge than doing words. And if capitalism works, you should make also more money by doing these tasks than just doing words, because let's face it, it's no fun and it's also very badly paid. So I think in general, it's a good movement. And what we also have seen is as you bring the rates down, the volumes increase. So nobody needs to be afraid of that machines will eventually do all these words. There's nothing left as it becomes cheaper. Of course, many more words will be translated into many more languages, and then all this expertise needs to be added. So I think actually for linguists, they should embrace that innovation, should be happy about it and see it as good news and not as something threatening their jobs.
So you point out that the Google Translate API alone is not sufficient, and you don't see that being sufficient to solve the sort of enterprise localization problem going forward. There's simply higher level tasks that people will need to do that are not just cranking out words.
Of course. I mean, Google Translate is a general purpose translation API which works miraculously well. Yeah? But as you know, every company has their own language, and it's not about being correct or wrong, but it's about how we call it and how we want to say it. And of course, a general purpose product like Google can never do that. That's impossible. Somebody needs to teach to the AI what the specific terminology, knowledge, style, and so on of this specific customer, this specific content type is. And that's, of course, a highly qualified task, and a task, by the way, which can easily be, or skills you learn, the expertise can easily apply to other areas, not only content translation, also content creation, search, categorization, many other areas, which, by the way, are the areas which we support with Coreon. So Coreon is not so much about translation. It's only one application. It's more about processing language, processing multilingual data. And for all these other purposes, translation is big, content creation is much bigger, search categorization is even bigger. So there are other areas, and all there you have to process data, you have to process text. I'm always saying half of the data is numerical, and we're pretty good in dealing with numbers. The other half is textual. we're pretty bad dealing with text.
That's
English
right.
maybe okay. In other
Yeah.
languages, it's often dysfunctional. So man, there's like a tons of work we can do and products we can develop and companies we can help to be able to deal with their, let's say, textual data in a decent way.
So your view is the opportunity lies in sort of a multilingual enterprise future, which is, as you say, right now, most companies do business in English or in their native language, and not much else outside of that. And there's a whole bunch of tasks that go around that.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is, of course, companies have company languages in most cases, or corporate languages in most cases, it's English, right? And if we talk, of course, we use English. Yeah? But what they often don't realize is that out there, there's the consumer, right? And so people, citizens, customers, and they create more and more content. They are not only consuming content, this old broadcast model, they are talking back to the companies. They're on social media. They're supposed to file some support requests, whatever. Governments try to talk to their citizens and so on. So once you have everybody on, like we are getting there with the internet, well, of course, only, let's say in Germany, maybe 40% have a decent passive knowledge of English when it gets active. So when they're supposed to create content, you're maybe down to 5. If you go to a very specific field, maybe to 2%, right? So if these people are all supposed to contribute and be part of this content sharing and knowledge sharing world, well, it has to be multilingual. And another effect is with all this content which is being created, if you then as a company only can analyze the English content and understand only the English content, well, then you maybe understand 10% of your customers. So with the democratization of information and data and the ubiquity of the internet, multilingual becomes a must. It's simply you can't do it without. And if you look what there really is available in terms of text analytics, knowledge management, and so, it's pretty sad. Most of things only work with English. Even bigger languages like English, German, French, Spanish, French, German. The basic natural language processing doesn't work too well. Not to talk about all the smaller languages.
So for the would-be entrepreneurs out there, it sounds like you're making a compelling case that there are more opportunities to start interesting and important companies in language. Is that true?
Well, I mean, of course, my field is language, but there's a lot more to language than translation. Let's put it this way. And there are tons of opportunities. I'm also active as a business angel. Only recently made an angel investment into a company which is using AI to automatically create social media posts. And again, in a collaborative AI mode, it's still not good enough that you just let the AI write the content and then post it as with translation. But of course, if you work collaboratively and somebody looks over it, makes some corrections, it's of course much more effective than writing it from scratch, like with translation. Yeah? So there are tons of these opportunities out there because most professionals deal, let's say, 80% of the day with dealing with text. And the number crunching, we're pretty good at. So it's left to CFOs and some accountants, but the rest of us are reading emails, writing reports, creating social media articles. We need to understand manuals, whatever, right? We deal with text all day long.
Right. Well, Jochen, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been a joy. You've sort of
Well, thank you
been
for
there
having me.
since the beginning of really this sort of language industry as it took shape, and now still in it, and starting new companies. So thanks for the work that you've done and the legacy that you've left in the industry.
Thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure.
Okay,
Bye bye.
thanks.